Do you have a paranormal encounter you'd like to share with us? Send us an email with your story for a chance of it being featured on Weird World. The lonely hamlet of Trevor Major contained several small houses and cottages, as well as a Norman church and manor house standing a little outside the village. The manor house had stood unoccupied since 1896, perhaps because any previous tenant would find unthinkable the prospect of passing another night there. It was the news of its nearby trout streams that led Evan and his flatmate, Jack Singleton, to rent the house for a month between mid-May and mid-June, with an option for renewal. They were actually to cut short their tenancy to less than 3 weeks for events quite unrelated to fishing. The young men arrived from town on a cloudless afternoon and surveyed the untended garden and beyond an extensive meandering stream over which the keen anglers would have fishing rights. Above the house stood a brick kiln in a ruinous state, next to a shallow pit overgrown with wildflowers where the clay had obviously once been dug. The brick kiln could also be seen through a gap in the pine trees from a sitting room inside the spacious house. That morning, Evan and Jack had sent 2 old and valued servants, Mr. and Mrs. Franklin, to make the place comfortable for their arrival. Mrs. Franklin greeted them at the front door and said that her husband had gone into the village to buy a few necessities. The men got in a couple of hours fishing before his return, when he mentioned that their arrival had seemed to arouse a good deal of interest. Franklin had been questioned a dozen times as to whether they really intended to stay in the house, and his assurance that they did produced silence and a shaking of heads. It was a warm evening, but on entering the sitting room after dinner that night, Evan felt himself shiver with a sense of there being something unseen and unheard and terrible near him. In the panels of the oak-lined room there hung some half-dozen watercolour sketches, which they realised had been painted with extraordinary finish and delicacy, each representing some aspect of the house or garden. The most careful and arresting of all was a study of the brick kiln, and in this painting alone there was a human figure. A man dressed in grey peered into the open door of the kiln, from which emanated a fierce red glow. His face, in profile, showed a youngish man, clean-shaven, with a long aquiline nose and square chin. From the chimney of the kiln there issued a thin stream of grey smoke. On closer examination, the men realised that every one of the paintings included an image of the kiln, whether in full view or seen faintly between the trees, and in each the chimney was smoking. Even when the kiln would be hidden by the house, the artist, who had signed their name F.A., put it in just the same. A fortnight of the men's holiday passed without incident, although by then Evan had mentioned to Jack his curious feeling of something dreadful being close at hand. Jack admitted that he had felt oddly the same way. They were sitting outside after dinner, and at that same moment the house door swung outwards, letting out a shaft of light from the hall, then gently swung to again. It was as if something had stealthily entered. On returning inside, they found Mrs. Franklin looking pale and startled. She had heard footsteps behind her in Evan's room upstairs, and her candle had blown out without a breath of wind around. Jack went to help her relight the candle, and a bell rang in the servants' quarters. Franklin emerged to say that it had come from Jack's room, but Jack was with Mrs. Franklin in Evan's room. The innocuous but unnerving events stayed with Evan, who had troubled sleep that night, hearing footsteps outside his door and even the door handle turning. The next day he left Jack fishing in heavy rain from a muddy, rising river, and returned to the house at about 5 to write some letters. By 7 he had finished, and just as he got up to light candles, thought he saw Jack's figure emerge from the bushes that bordered the path to the stream. Then he instantaneously saw that it was not Jack at all, but a stranger, only some 6 yards from the window. After pausing, the man came up close to the window so that his face nearly touched the glass and looked intently at Evan. Although unable to distinguish his features clearly, Evan felt he had never seen the man before, but there was something familiar about his face and figure. He appeared to smile at Evan, but the smile was one of inscrutable evil and malevolence, and immediately he walked on straight towards the house door opposite him and out of sight of the window. Evan immediately made for the front door to open it to him and learn his business. Instead, he looked out onto the empty gravel drive and the heavy falling rain in the thick dusk. Even as he looked, he felt something that he could not see push by him through the half-open door and pass into the house. Then the stairs creaked, and a moment after a bell rang. Franklin quickly mounted the stairs and knocked at Jack's door, only for Evan to tell him that Jack was still out. This was the second time his bell had rung for no reason. Evan's sense of horror deepened when he returned to the sitting room and suddenly saw why the stranger outside had seemed so familiar to him. In all respects, he resembled the figure that peered into the kiln. It was actually more than a resemblance, it was an identity. At that moment, Evan saw the face of cold fear, his heart leaping and cracking in his throat. Was this man an invisible pushing force he had first seen outside, then felt entering the house, heard ringing the bell? He tried to reason the phenomena away, but his terror still surged. He sat down to again distract himself with letters, when an unusual smell came to his nostrils. In the distance he could see smoke coming out of the chimney of the kiln, and he smelt the odour of roasting meat wafting on the wind from that direction. When Jack returned from fishing, he went straight to the painting on the wall and stared at it. He had also seen the man in the picture, who had stood near him on the river for about an hour. He realised he was a ghost when he cast his line right through him. At about 7, the man had walked up to the house. Evan told him that he believed the ghost to now be inside the house. Another strange thing was that the chimney of the long-disused kiln was smoking. Jack went to investigate the kiln and found nothing stirring except that the interior was faintly luminous, and against the black of the sky he could see a wisp of thick white smoke floating northwards. The friends' next few hours passed undisturbed until the following night, when a hellish activity was manifested. Evan was preparing for bed when he heard a bell ringing furiously and a shout. He went straight to Jack's room, where he tapped at the door and heard Jack calling loudly from inside to take care. He was close to the door. He found Jack sweltering with fear after the spectre had emerged from his inner room, carrying a great long carving knife. Jack added that all around the edge of his clothes, at his collar and wrists, were little white flickering flames. Jack slept on the sofa in Evan's room that night, and the following day there was no sense of the dreadful presence in the house. After a successful day's fishing, the pair were in the sitting room when suddenly from overhead they heard a tread of feet, a violent pealing of the bell, and yell after yell as of someone in mortal agony. Both rushed up to Jack's bedroom, where they found in a dull light the man bending over some dark, huddled object. He again had a long knife in his hand, which he wiped on the mass that lay at his feet. They saw what it was, a woman with head nearly severed, thankfully not Mrs. Franklin. Then the apparition vanished, and they stood in a dark, empty room. "And he takes her to the Brick Kiln," said Jack unsteadily. Evan and Jack cut short their fishing holiday, and a week later Jack handed Evan a guidebook to Sussex, open at the description of Trevor Major. He read, "Just outside the village stands the picturesque manor house, once the home of the artist and notorious murderer Francis Adam. It is here that he dispatched his wife in a fit, it is believed, of groundless jealousy, disposing of her remains by burning them in a brick kiln. Certain charred fragments found 6 months afterwards led to his arrest and execution. The two young men concluded that they preferred to leave the house with its brick kiln and pictures signed F.A. to others.